This is Karen with NewClevelandRadio.net, and it is time for the Intentionality Gurus. And today, Candace has a very interesting topic for us. It is a news with an S kind of diet. Now, I have to tell you, Candace, as soon as I hear the word diet, I start to shake in my boots because, diets and I don't get along very well. So give me a hint what we're talking about.
Well, with diet, I mean, the framework I like to use is we're just going to be intentional about what we're consuming, literally and figuratively.
Okay.
All right. So it doesn't require any strict adherence, but this, with some of the other tools that we've discussed over, prior podcasts, like the recipe for good habits, more or less combining recipe with diet, is how this kind of came up.
Okay.
So in a given day, how much news are you exposed to? Not necessarily what you reach out for, but what comes at you. So if you have 24 hours,
yeah.
what proportion?
Yeah. So way too much. Whether it's I'm working on the computer and something flashes up on me, or something on my phone, or if I have the TV on or the radio on, or my husband sharing all the news tidbits he gets all day. So it's 24/7 for me.
Yeah, and so a lot has changed in the news industry, because there was a time, and younger generations wouldn't necessarily understand this, but there was a time when we would get our newspaper in print, generally in the morning, or maybe late in the day when we had time to read it. We would listen to television, but the television news, you would have the three main broadcasting systems that would feed us the news in time frames that were limited. And we would get a broad array. I mean, how broad can you get just across three broadcasting systems, but nonetheless. And we didn't have those things called chyrons, which are the little feeding tape at the bottom of the screen, where we're constantly seeing, other stuff to distract us, and like, what do I pay attention to first? Does that sound familiar?
It certainly does, because I'll tell you, usually in the morning before my husband goes to work, we're sitting at the dining room table having breakfast, and he's listening to the news on the TV, and I'm reading what is going across the screen. It's, so we're not even paying attention to the same information at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. And so the other elements are that the news, because there's so many now, and so many sources of news, or if you want to call it news, I don't know if it all is technically news, or a lot of it is opinion. And the competition for attention, eyeballs and ears, is so fierce that, the data I've looked at indicates that it's become more extreme in its positions and louder, not necessarily literally, but in terms of what they have to do to get that attention, get those eyeballs and those ears to pay attention. So it's skewed in that way. Maybe it was that way in proportion in prior generations and so on. I don't know that. But all I know is now you can't avoid it. It's 24/7 if you want it 24/7.
Yeah.
I've seen shows where they have multiple monitors where they're monitoring all of them. And even just the word monitor, it says something, because it requires some kind of attention and engagement with the screen.
Right.
So the idea is, we went from maybe having 3 meals a day, if I'm going to use that analogy, to having a buffet all day.
Right.
All right. And what the science shows, and what we've discussed previously, is that we have events, we have thoughts that are triggered by the events. Thoughts trigger certain chemical reactions in the body that can induce a mood, and then that can control behavior, or at least trigger behavior. So it's the same in this instance. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I've been, I was a political science major in college. What do you do with that? Well, I went to law school. So I'm engaged in news and social justice kinds of issues, as though have always interested me. But I've noticed that I can't quite bring down my level of anxiety. It's like a little hum in the background. And I've been trying to figure out a way that I can reliably disengage from the news, because on one hand, because of all that past training and interest, I don't want to not be on top of the facts and make my own decisions.
Right.
I've learned from past experiences in my old area of law where we were engaged in some statewide political issues that on legislation. When I attended some hearings and I heard colleagues come back and tell other colleagues, come back to Cleveland to tell other colleagues what happened, I thought, wait, that's not what I heard. So I
Right.
learned the lesson that I have to digest it for myself and make my own independent, informed decisions. And I work at that. But I'm realizing what a toll it's taking. And then happen chance had me in the car the other day when I heard a woman, I didn't get all the particulars, who was a journalist or whatever you call them, correspondent for Slate Online Magazine, was talking about a news diet. And I thought, I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but how great that is.
Absolutely.
And then she was talking about some ways that she limited her ingestion of the news. So me blabbing on about that, what occurs to you?
Well, it's interesting because just like you, I remember growing up, we got the morning paper, but my father never had time to read it until he got home from work. So he got the morning paper. But when he would read it in the evening, it wasn't like that much had changed, in that span of 8 or 10 hours since the paper had been delivered. And what I do remember is when everybody started getting on the, cable networks, it was like, oh, you can have news all day long. And it was like, well, why do we need it all day long? And so up until maybe the last year or so, I just really identified that only thing I need to know in the morning is the weather. So I don't need to listen to the news. At the end of the day, around dinner time, I will watch the national news rather than the local news. Because the national news sort of like gives me a meltdown of what has happened or what is going to happen. But like you, if I'm watching the news with both my son and my husband, all three of us walk away hearing something different.
Yeah. And in terms emotionally, your sense of, like your gut sense about things, how does it feel?
I don't like, so let me backtrack. If I'm watching the news and there's a lot of lead-ins to the news, I usually then get very stressed at that point, and I only pick up the information on those one or two topics. But because I'm so stressed, I typically will not hear all the information.
Yeah, so you hear the promo, the what do you call it, the hype around,
Right.
stay tuned for this or that, etc. And it sounds urgent, and then sometimes you find out it wasn't urgent. I vividly remember a local newscaster years ago, very prominent. I can't think of what her name was now. But anyway, she was like the person. Wilma, what was
Yeah.
Wilma?
Oh, Wilma Smith. Yes.
All right.
Yep.
So I know this is when I stopped watching local news. There was a big promo. It must have been the sweep season where they need to get their numbers high in order to, whatever they do with those numbers. And there was a video that they kept showing when these promo things about we're going to have a special coverage on such and such a topic. And it was a person who looked like Wilma in a dark garage, poorly lit
Yeah,
garage, going to her car, and she got attacked. Well, it turns out that didn't happen. That wasn't news. That was just an illustration of what could happen. And I thought, this is bull.
wow, yeah,
I don't have time to watch this stuff. And it triggered, like anxiety, that, fight or flight stuff. And we're mammals, so we have that mechanism in us. And we need to pay attention, be intentional about how we're being manipulated by the media.
exactly. When the war in Ukraine began,
Mhm.
my husband started watching, I think it's called French news or something like that, but it comes from France.
Mhm.
And it's on every night at from like 6 to 6:30. And he was watching it because he felt that it had no bias in the messaging. And to some degree, he's absolutely right. You heard two sides and four sides and six sides of every story. But I found their news to be more graphic than anything that I've seen on American stations. And I think he started to realize it too, because after about a month, he said, I just can't watch this anymore. And it would make us want to just like jump out of our seats and go do something, to help our neighbor, or, to go to Ukraine and fight. And it was like, none of that was something we were going to do.
Yeah, and that reminds me that, one of the things that I've always said about the news is I feel I have a duty to be informed, as a citizen, so that I'm not being manipulated by others. I'm sure there's always going to be some element of being manipulated by who knows what, with who knows what motives. But what the science shows is that whether it's movies, I mean, we know that movies and TV shows can invoke emotional responses in us.
Right.
Some of us like to go to action movies, some of us like to go to, romantic movies, others, it's something maybe, documentary type thing. But we're going and we're getting an emotional response from it. And what the science shows is that that some of those responses are beneficial and some of them are not. They're not healthy for us physically and or mentally.
Right.
And again, just to repeat, the emotional response we get triggers the chemicals, either stress chemicals or feel good chemicals in the body. And then those can help support or sustain moods. And when we have moods, that it can be kind of self-repeating
Right.
chemical stresses and so on. And they've done studies on this because I did a deeper dive in this when after listening to this news diet concept, because I had been limiting, but I still kept slipping back into the habit of watching the news, particularly, with the, House hearings and so on. I need to, be a serious consumer of the news and also a good citizen. But what the science shows is that the normal techniques we might use to disengage from something that's triggering us don't work. All right, they're less effective, I should say. Maybe don't work is too strong, but in essence, we have to come up with a different game plan. Hence the news diet concept. So we can't
Okay.
avoid it. It's, what bleeds leads. It's 24/7. It's has a negative bias itself. And it's like breathing in polluted thoughts and air, right?
Right.
So in the context of putting some limits on it, there's two extremes, not doing any of it. And I did that for a while. I stopped reading the local paper, didn't watch the local news because that tended to be more hype. And then, I was less engaged on the national level, except on, the major events and their
Right.
key issues and so on. So when you guys disengaged from the French news, what solution did you come up with?
Well, so we were watching the French news and then we were watching the national news. So French news was like 6 to 6:30, then 6:30 to 7. Um, we were watching national news. And interestingly enough, the information really was not the same. They were looking at many of these same topics, but in a different way, which I found very confusing. It's like, French news would talk about why we had, the increase in gas, but it was for XYZ reasons. And then the national news would talk about, the increase in price in gas, and it's for ABC reasons. And it's like, which is right? I want to believe both of them are providing me with the right information, but if it doesn't mesh, then, who should I really listen to?
And how can you verify the information? Because sometimes the sources are biased. It's hard to know real stuff from
Exactly.
contrived stuff.
Well, and I started Googling things too. And it was like, and I'll never forget one night at dinner, we had just finished watching French news, national news came on, and story was about the same, but took it different directions. So I went out and Googled it, and I found like 5 other interpretations. And it's like, why do we have to make everything so confusing? And I know a lot of it really is opinion, even though the news is supposed to be factual. It does become somewhat personalized.
Very much, very much.
Yeah.
And I remember in the local paper, the main local paper, I guess it was the last one standing, there was one particular reporter who I noticed started to insert the word I in his
Right.
articles. And I remember having this, I didn't catch it consciously. It was just something seemed off. And then the more articles of his I read, because he was a regular contributor, I realized, wait a minute, this isn't being labeled as an opinion piece. This is, his opinion. And he was giving interpretations, not just the facts. And it just left me feeling, gee, this doesn't seem right somehow. But
Exactly.
in order to verify our facts, we have to slog through other opinion pieces. It just becomes more work, right?
Right. Exactly.
So we have this tension between trying to be responsible citizens and, being interested and just wanting to know things, and then being bombarded by all this opinion stuff that has a negative bias that triggers all the bad chemicals and so on. So in listening to this, I think she's a writer for Slate magazine. She was talking about the diet concept, and I didn't get to hear the whole program, so I may be misstating some of her ideas, but then I had some of my own, I think. Maybe they happen to be hers. But I realized, and doing my deeper dive search on this, I realized that even though the news industry has changed in terms of how we are delivered, it used to be we would pull it to ourselves. Now it's being pushed at us.
Right.
And it's everywhere, even just the visual imagery, et cetera. As you said, some of it is very graphic. And I've noticed, not that I'm a prude, but I've noticed that swearing is like everywhere now.
Right.
Words, and they're not the list of those that usually got deleted or bleeped. I've noticed they're not bleeping some of those words, which is just kind of interesting. And everything is fear laden. And I've gotten to the point where I've noticed that as soon as certain words are used, not the swear words, but as soon as certain words are used, I start to get that apprehension. I'm watching the news always in a state of some apprehension, like what's going to happen. So in thinking it through, I realized, well, I can't change the news. I can't change it coming at me, in some respects, but I can be really intentional, paying attention to what's going on. Oh, there was another there was another study that talked about how the normal mechanisms that they would use in psychology to either distract or lessen the emotional impact are not as effective with the consumption of the news.
Really interesting.
Yeah, so that the ability to distract with something that would be more pleasant, or some of the things that we might engage in, and that the emotional disturbance, they called it, would be more persistent. It would be harder to break that mood, and then that influences our negative thinking. So we leave the news going into the world, maybe being a little more cynical and negative and looking for, some of the negative things and so on. So it's kind of a vicious cycle. So
Well, one of the things I've noticed is that the younger generation, they're getting their news from Twitter. And Twitter is social media. I mean,
I was going to say, is it news?
Well, so I guess this was probably within the last couple of weeks. And of course, it had to do with sports, but my son, came running into the office and he goes, Vince McMahon, is no longer the head of, I don't even know which wrestling league it is. And I said, oh, okay. And he starts giving me all this information of illegal things he's done. And I said, was that on the news? And he goes, no, it was on Twitter. And it's like, but Twitter, who's it coming from? Like, is it just a person who put together this information? And he goes, oh no, this person's reputable. And they look at reputable differently than we did. We looked at, ABC, CBS, and NBC, getting quality newscasters and reporters to bring us the news. And now
give us more than one side to offer the alternative positions on the same topic.
Exactly. And I just find it interesting that they're okay with just repeating something that somebody else put out on social media.
Yeah, that's now my stress chemicals are being triggered.
Well, I didn't mean to trigger you, but hey, but
I mean, it says a lot, because where do we go from here? Because if we're not tethered to some sense of fact, provable facts, then I don't know where we cycle to. It just
right.
can take on its own life. So in terms of the diet, I was trying to figure out, okay, so I've tried the other things. I don't have news after a certain point. Well, gee, sometimes, say with the congressional hearings and so on, I didn't have a choice about that. And then of course I'm bombarded by these other things. I tried to go to stations or online sources that didn't have that, but I have yet to find one that doesn't have all this other attention grabbing kind of stuff. And I have noticed the algorithms in the various search engines must be targeting me, because now depending on what I'm searching for, I get more of that.
Yep.
All right. So, I'm trying to be aware of those things. But what I started with, and, I'm new to this, but what I'm suggesting we all pay attention to is just paying attention, being intentional about it. But we can possibly go back to some elements of the what, when, how, and why in terms of the news, and that we naturally had just because of the delivery mechanism. So I'm still not good at putting the guardrails on the time frames, because I don't have a lot of control necessarily over that. But I've eliminated some sources. There was a time when I watched not all, but I watched alternative opinion shows that were not my particular opinions.
Okay.
And but it would cause so much agita. I wanted to fling myself out the window. I just was like, I can't do this. So I'm trying to be responsible and hear what other people are saying, but I can't do it. So, but also avoiding the sources that have any element of sensationalism in them.
Got it.
And that's been really wonderful in many ways, because it does tend to quell that, I just feel like my gut is getting activated, and my pulse probably is increasing, those kinds of things. So any particular things that you might think of for you?
Well, as you're talking about this, I was thinking more about my brother. When my mom was ill and we were all living in this small space together, he would sit in front of the TV doing work with CNN on all day long. And he would yell at the TV and get upset with the things that were being said over and over again. I mean, he was raising his blood pressure, obviously, and he continues to do that today. So when he's at home working, his laptop is on his lap and the TV is on. And when he hears something that he doesn't like, he just argues with it. And my sister-in-law, poor thing, she'll say to him, why do you do this all day long? And he'll go, well, somebody's got to take a stand. And it's like, but you're in the living room. Okay, you're not taking a stand. Now, he does write a blog every week that really encompasses everything that he heard during the week that really has him upset. And yet, if you say anything about anything that you may have heard on the news, local, national, whatever, he already has a comeback for it. Even if he's agreeing with it,
Mhm.
he's so angry about it. And I've noticed there are a lot of people out there that are that way, that they feel that they've got to get every piece of information and, have their say about it, even if it's in the privacy of their home.
Yeah, which just underscores the point that we're elevating the stress chemicals in our body. So they're staying heightened. They don't go down again as a rule. And so cortisol, surging through us. And I don't know what the body load of cortisol would be, but science is starting to show, or has been showing, that cortisol and the other stress chemicals can be some of the contributors to an overall body inflammatory reaction, which then can support certain diseases, et cetera. And I'm not saying I'm a scientist, I'm just saying based on what I think are credible
Sure.
sources of science. So it's will be more triggered more easily, triggered more dramatically and more easily, more often. And the toll on the body is, to be, I guess, determined. Maybe some people can escape that, but heart disease and those kinds of
Right.
things. But I think if we can just be aware that here's this thing going on in the background constantly that's taking a toll on us, and then it's those emotions and those feelings and that ambient sense of anxiety and trepidation that's coloring our world, so that we're going to be looking for more of that just because that's how we're hardwired as
Right.
and so on. So I'm getting a little anxious just even having this conversation.
Well, I think I'm going to try to figure out some sort of a news diet for myself so that I can keep my blood pressure down. And I hope our listeners will come out and comment about this, because it is an important subject. It could be what is making us a very angry society right now.
Yeah, not unlike air pollution or something. So
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again. We will see you in 2 weeks. And to our listeners, feel free to contact us at newclevelandradio@gmail.com, or go to the intentionalitygurus.com and check out the website. Have a great day.
thank you, Karen.
Bye.